Hi everyone. We'll be getting started shortly. All right. Hi everyone, and welcome to the second event in this Building World-Class Team series on retention intervention. Now, before we kick off, I'd like to get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way first. This webinar is being recorded. Captions are available during this webinar. If you'd like to enable them, there should be an option on the bottom tab or in the menu by clicking the three dots icon. Chat is open, so feel free to talk to us or amongst yourselves and pop a hello if you'd like there. We are moderating it to keep this a safe space, and any inappropriate messages will be removed. If you have any questions for the panelists, make sure to drop it into the Q&A, which is next to chat. There'll be an opportunity for the panelists to answer your questions during the event, but feel free to drop a question at any time. But to kick us off, over to you, Melissa.
Thanks so much, Adnan, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those that don't know us, we are the Honeycomb Works, and our mission is for everyone at work to feel like they belong and are free to invent. We help organizations build inclusive and innovative cultures through behavior change and data, because cultures are created habit by habit, person by person. It's the things that people do on a day-to-day basis or don't do that make someplace safe for everyone to speak up, share ideas, challenge each other, and do brilliant, amazing things. So we have a platform. It looks like a honeycomb, hence the name, the Honeycomb Works. And it helps individuals develop positive habits and organizations to understand their strengths and their biggest areas of risk. Now, before we go any further, we'd love to learn a little bit more about you. Please feel free to say hi in the chat, but we're also going to pop up a poll so you can let us know what brought you here today. Will just help us to make sure that we're answering all the really important burning questions for you and contextualizing it well. So while you're doing that, I'll share our plan for, I was going to say the day, but just don't worry, 90 minutes. That's all we're keeping you here for. So we're going to start with a lightning talk on retention, some interesting facts that you need to know just to set the foundation. Then we're going to move on to our brilliant panel discussion and then share some ways that you can take action. So specific steps that you can take immediately, because we are all about impact and not just talking about things and improving our knowledge, but actually making a difference by putting stuff into practice. And then we'll end with your questions to our experts. So the session will run for 90 minutes, as I said, but we are conscious that people might need to drop off at the hour mark. We understand the back-to-back meeting situation that many people have. So don't worry if you do, you'll get a recording. Please do add your questions into the Q&A function in Zoom as we go along, because we will be addressing those at the end. And we'd love to keep in touch after the event. So please do subscribe to updates for us. And we're also going to drop the link in the chat just to make sure Zoom has a new feature. So you should be seeing slides. If you're not seeing slides, look at the tabs on the top and click on the Honeycomb Works screen piece of it. So probably about time to introduce the Honeycomb team hosting you today. So you've already met Adnan, who said hello. He is our delivery manager and our data analyst. So he ensures that everyone has a positive experience working with us and also extracts the insights from our platforms and technologies to help organizations make smart decisions. He's also managing the technology for us today. And I will shortly be turning you over to Marin Bird, who is our research and impact lead. So she ensures that everything we do is grounded in science, evidence, and also really importantly, empathy. She'll be sharing the most important things for you to know about retention. And I'm Melissa. Hi, founder and CEO of the Honeycomb Works, and I'll be moderating the panel discussion shortly. So I'm going to pass you over to Marin for now, but I will see you again in a little bit. Marin.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you everybody for joining this afternoon. I'm delighted to be here and to share some of the important research around why retention and what exactly we think you should focus on. As Melissa said, my name is Marin Bird and I lead on research and impact at the Honeycomb Works. Before I jump in, let's just quickly revisit the poll and let's have a look. Apologies, I can see some folks haven't quite got there in terms of getting the answer in, but I'm going to end it now anyway, just so we can have a look at what's going on. So interestingly, I always love when there's a really clear majority answer. It makes things really focused. And that majority answer, as you can see, want to see if there is anything I should be doing that I'm not. I think hopefully brilliantly we will be addressing exactly that question today. And then I think the next largest group there is in no issues, and I want to keep it that way. I think that's also a really interesting response. I would love for the folks who are in that category, if that shifts for you, if you're understanding about the issues you may or may not have, or may not be coming, or may not be something that's in the ether. If we introduce anything, not to say that we want to introduce anything to worry you, but if any of your thinking shifts on that particular point throughout today, would love if you feed that back to us, because always interested to hear if we are changing your ideas or introducing anything in at any point. Okay, thank you very much for adding your thoughts to that. So as Melissa said, what I'm going to do for the next 10 minutes or so is just share some of the research around exactly what retention is, why it's important, and then I'll pass you up to the panel and we'll dig into the conversation. Ultimately, what is retention? Well, we're thinking about how many people leave their jobs over a certain period when we talk about retention. I think that's probably the understanding we all had coming into today. But, and you might start to see a bit of a pattern, I hope, in our approach if you've been to our other workshops, there is more that you need to consider when thinking about retention. So you need to start thinking about retention from a really critical and nuanced perspective. And by that, I mean asking questions like, who is leaving? At what point are they leaving? And why are they leaving? Is it connected to how they progress and develop, or perhaps how they don't progress and develop? And ultimately, I suppose, if you take nothing from today's webinar and conversation except this point, it's going to be really important, because if you are not taking that nuanced approach to data, you might be really missing some very, very important information. So just as an example, say you look at your retention over a year and you think, oh gosh, only 10% of our employees are leaving. You might come away and think, fantastic, that's a really good retention rate. And you would be right in this current climate, that probably would be very positive. But what if you went back and dug into that 10% and went, oh my gosh, they're all women and they're all in non-engineering roles? That would, I think, be a big red flag that says, actually, there is something going on here for retention. The data could be telling you that you do have a problem in your culture, or at least something to dig into. And the other kind of framework, I suppose, that I'd like to introduce for thinking about what we mean by retention is maybe we're just talking about a duty of care beyond recruitment. And by that, I mean, what are you doing to make sure no one has an awful experience? And I think it's really just flipping the idea of, well, what is retention? How do I focus on it? It's just stepping up as a manager, as a leader, as someone with influence in your culture, and just making sure that this is something you're actively thinking about. If it feels a bit daunting or overwhelming, I realize I'm probably the Wally image hopefully isn't adding to that too much. Please don't worry, because that's exactly what we're going to try and cover in today's webinar, and something we'd love to have continued conversations about. So then the second thing I'm going to think about in the next 5 minutes or so I have, why is it important? Well, I think given that you're here, you probably think it's important. You're convinced, I'm hoping. If you're not, hopefully you will be over the course of the hour. But equally, I always think it's helpful to share some of the stats and some of the research so you can share it with other people. It's a really effective way to gain support if you need to have those conversations. So please feel free, take a screenshot, take a snap, get in touch with us. I'm really happy to share any of this research as a follow-up. So the first kind of compelling piece of evidence, I think, is really around this huge figure of what it costs to replace an employee. So this was a piece of research that looked across 5 different industries specifically, and really obviously had to average out what that looks like, but it is over £30,000 to replace an employee who's earning £25,000 or more a year. Maybe you're thinking, I have no one, like, how do we get to that figure? That seems absolutely outrageous. So perhaps take a moment to reflect, where do you think the majority of that cost lies? Where did that figure come from? And hopefully it makes a bit more sense then when we jump into the detail. So the majority of the cost is actually the cost of lost productivity while someone new gets to optimal performance. The estimate for how long that is across many different industries is 28 weeks, and it costs about £25,000, which I will tell you shocked me when I came across it. It seemed like an enormous figure, but it makes sense when you think about how difficult it is to learn to do particularly the type of work that you all are doing in this very specialist industry. And then that second kind of cost is, of course, the things that might have come immediately to your mind, the idea of advertising and interviewing and getting people to cover. Now, this second kind of framing, I think, behind why we think it's so important to focus on retention. This is not second in my list because I think it's less important, not at all. It's second because I want to have a bit of time to dig into it. And that is because we know that this problem with retention harms different groups of people unequally. So ultimately, even if your budget allows you to spend 30 grand recruiting people every 5 months, you should still focus on retention because there's a lot of harm involved in people having to leave jobs and also find new work, all of that stuff. And when I say it harms people unequally, here's just one example of what I mean. So this stat here is the percentage of women leaving the workforce. This is specifically from the energy and utilities sector in engineering, but this pattern is consistent across engineering more generally. And as you can see, put very simply, that percentage is increasing. So there is a slight increase, but it is very, very important that that is something we're focusing on and addressing, not shrugging off and allowing to continue. And then building out that picture of why women are leaving the workforce or what that means for engineering more generally, another piece of the picture. So the focus, I think, a lot in this conversation around diversity in engineering and really building up the best possible teams is in attracting people and that recruitment piece. And yes, it is part of the puzzle, but actually there is really good evidence to suggest that that is improving. So as you can see, there's an increase in women in that kind of early career age group. So they're coming in and then something is happening and they're leaving. So that's why retention is such an important part of this puzzle. The data picture points to them not being retained at as high a level as we need to have progress. So then, and again, you'll forgive me, I am, of course, talking about an intersectional approach. So we have women who are also part of this racially minoritized group. And, you know, it's not so clear cut as I'm presenting on these slides, but just to give you a vision of what's happening. This piece is around racially minoritized engineers, and they are 16 percentage points more likely to leave the industry than white engineers. So a really stark, again, focus on why retention needs to be a focus. Again, just linking on to another piece of data to really get that home for you. This again, specific to the energy and utility skills sector, but as you can see, 16% of that sector were racially minoritized engineers, and then 14.1% of leavers were also from that group. So there really is very little progress happening if we take those two figures into account and look at them side by side. And then finally, in terms of these stats, there are so many of them, and I'm really happy to share the data for anyone who's very interested, but this is just another look from a different demographic group perspective. Disabled people account for 8.3% of the leavers in 2023, yet they only make up 4.3% of the overall sector, which as an aside is far, far lower than the percentage of the UK working population who are disabled, which is about 24%. So hugely underrepresented to begin, and then they're leaving at a much higher rate. So I said it costs you a lot as an organization, as a startup, absolutely, and that's a huge consideration. But I also really didn't want to ignore the fact that this also costs people a lot. So both emotionally, very difficult to leave a job. I'm sure we've all done it, not easy. Very difficult to find a job. You have to look whilst you're working, you have to interview, you have to prep. It's really hard work. And then there's financial costs, relocation, coaching, all of the things that are probably coming to your mind. If we are asking certain groups to bear the burden of that a little bit more, then that is only going to be more compounding factor, I suppose, in the inequity that we see in the industry. And then this is not just about us talking about your duty of care. That should be your primary concern. But actually, if you want to be successful, you need to address this. You need to address the retention of folks who are underrepresented in the industry, because otherwise you will not have the best possible team. I can't dig into it. I would love to, but we've spent loads of time talking about it. We're happy to have another conversation with anyone who needs it. world-class teams are diverse teams. The best work happens with diverse teams who share in a psychologically safe environment. And this, again, the final, and I promise you, I'm going to pass over to the panel in a moment to help give you some strategies and tools and give you things to address all of these really important considerations. But I just do want you to have a framework for why it's worth your while and the importance of addressing it. But this, it can hurt your culture. Aside from all of those things I've shared, staff morale, people lose their friends, people build up relationships, people figure out best ways of working. If people are leaving all the time, that is not going to have a positive impact on the morale. Psychological safety, again, that is so crucial to innovation, to the best possible work. It's the belief that you can make mistakes, they won't be held against you. You feel able to be creative and take risks. It takes time. You need to test that. You need to do little versions of it with your colleagues and find out if it's safe. And that happens when you have long relationships with people, and it's really difficult to do it quickly. And productivity, I mentioned it, takes ages to get up to speed. And also people have to cover work. So that's going to have an impact too. And that's just all very general, but what about engineering startups specifically? Here are just 3 reasons why it's very likely this is going to have even more impact than some of those more generalized kind of early stats I shared. Small teams, somebody leaves, it's a big deal. Super highly skilled and niche. It's very difficult to replace those people, as you well know. And fast moving. I think I'd be really interested if anyone thinks they could take 28 weeks to skill someone up and train someone up in their particular context, because that seems like it would be difficult to me. And then very finally, I love to share stats, I love to share data, but equally we do an awful lot of qualitative research. So as part of Building Culture Plus with the Royal Academy of Engineering, we spoke to 30 plus founders and CEOs and startups, and we heard about this particular topic again and again. And this is a really good quote to kind of sum it up. If anyone leaves, we're in trouble. It really had an impact on people's ability to hit their milestones, their ability to really create the products they wanted to create to get where they needed to get to. So it's a very, very important, pertinent focus for you all, I hope. And with that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to pass back over to Melissa, who's going to introduce you to our panel and then share some of the ways you can deal with this really challenging topic. Melissa, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Marin. I think one of the most depressing stats in there was the number of people coming in and the number of people going out. It really feels like we're gonna struggle to make any progress unless we change things around the culture that we're bringing people into. And so it is now my pleasure to introduce you to 4 people who are actively working on changing those cultures internally. So I am going to ask them to quickly introduce themselves to start with. So we'll go in order of the photos. So James, can we start off with you? Can you give a short introduction to who you are and what brings you here?
Hi, thanks, Melissa, and thanks, Marin, for that fantastic intro to the session. Yes, I'm James Kusen. I'm the VP of Operations and Product Owner at a cell and gene therapy / engineering company based in Stevenage. I'm here because all things to do with people and culture are very close and dear to my heart, because ultimately I think people are the most important thing to all the work that we do as organizations, and we have to do as much as we can to ensure that we're creating great, productive, and highly safe workspaces for people. And I think that starts with many things that have been discussed on this series, but I think the retention part is equally as important for all the many and more reasons that Marin introduced at the start. So yeah, that's me.
Absolutely, fantastic. Pavneet, over to you.
Thank you, Melissa. My name's Pavneet Khurana. I am an organizational psychologist and the co-founder of And For All. I work with startups and scale-ups on all things people, culture, and leadership, all through the lens of inclusion. At And For All, we assess inclusive cultures and help to plan your way forward.
Fantastic. Brian.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Evia. I am originally from San Francisco, and now I'm in London. I have been working with teams and startups and large enterprises since the mid-90s. I help align leadership, strategy, culture, and HR operations. And I currently work for mostly startups and portfolio companies of private equity and venture funds. And I'm here because Melissa and I met in 2018 when I hired Honeycomb to help at a startup that really needed the help, and I became a true believer in the model and in the clarity of the connection between the research and action steps to help people, because everybody needs help.
Thank you for that, Brian. And Sally, over to you.
Yeah, hi Melissa, hi everybody. I'm Sally Kennard. I'm the People and Talent Lead at Pure Affinity. We are a startup that's been going for about 10 years, and we're about to grow from probably 20 last year to 40 this year, so doubling in size. So I've loved working for startups probably over the last 10 years, and I think one of the things I really enjoy is how every person that you hire can really enhance the culture and can really have an impact. And so creating environments where they feel that they can be heard and put ideas forward and innovate and really collaborate with one another is really, really important to me. And I'm very lucky that I work for a CEO who really is aligned to the same way of thinking and really cares about that inclusive culture.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sally. And we're going to stay with you actually for our first question, which is around how do you actually understand your culture? And, you know, we know that, and interesting in the poll too, a lot of folks felt like, yeah, I think we're okay. But we want to make sure that we are doing the things that we need to do. How do you use data to figure out whether or not you are where you need to be? And tell us a little bit about that journey that you went on at Pure Affinity.
Definitely. So I think if anyone had asked me in my first few months at Pure Affinity, you know, how would you talk about the culture? And I would have said 100% is very, very inclusive. And there's a real psychological safety where people can put those ideas forward. And, you know, and that comes from the top, you know, the leadership team really encourage that. And for me, it's probably an environment where I've felt the most I could be my real self, like authentic self, not work Sally and outsider Sally. So when you guys approached us about doing the belonging survey, you know, we were really excited to do that and kind of really understand the temperature and feelings of people within the team. And I think it's quite important to have that anonymous survey to allow people to really be as open and honest as they can be. So we ran the survey. It was very easy to run. So thank you, Adnan, for supporting me with that. And when we got the results through, it focuses on things around, you know, sense of belonging, embracing failures, you know, feeling psychologically safe. So overall, the results were positive, but there were across the board in most of the areas, they're between 4 to 13% of people who didn't necessarily feel that way, you know, which I was saddened by, because you want people to be able to feel like they belong at work and they can put ideas forward. So my first thought was sadness, actually, you know, because that's not the culture that we were hoping to create. And wanted to see what we could do to make a difference. So we, in you know, being transparent, we talked through the results with the company-wide, with the whole organization, and broke everybody out into smaller groups to talk about what they think that we're doing well, because there are still definitely things we should continue doing. So what we're doing well, if there's anything we should start doing, and also if there's anything we should stop doing. And kind of through that, I think some of the key things we're looking at is just making sure it's really important, like in meetings, that everybody has an opportunity to talk and things like that. But actually digging a bit deeper into that, what we realized is some people don't think in a way where they're able to just come up with ideas on the spot and things. So making sure we're sharing agendas ahead of time, giving people that time to be able to think so that they can put ideas forward. And our hope will always be that they can speak up in those meetings and do that, but also giving them that opportunity to be able to put ideas forward beforehand. And yeah, so I think that's kind of just one of the things that we looked at that I think really helped. I actually was talking to James, one of the other panelists, the other day about the honeycomb app, and he was talking about how important it is to have that strong feedback culture. So we came away from that and instantly started planning to do some training around giving and receiving constructive feedback. Because again, you know, it's something that's going to be really, really important. You know, sometimes giving feedback, it's better you know, it's to give good constructive feedback is the kind thing to do, not necessarily the nice thing to do. And you want to be kind and help people to learn and to grow and to learn from mistakes and things like that. So these are definitely some of the things that we've done and we will continue to do, because it was really easy for me to say, yeah, we have this great culture, and people were talking to us and sharing with us lots of great things, you know, because I'm always asking how people are doing. I can't help it. It's part, you know, it's just part of my nature. But having different ways for people to be able to share their thoughts in an anonymous way or in person, or, you know, yeah, through different surveys, I think is really important. So this is definitely something we'll continue to build on. We're building our own engagement survey, which won't just focus on belonging and inclusion, but we will be looking to run this every year. It's been really valuable for us. Definitely learned a lot from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you raise a really important point there that, you know, if you're a small organization, you might percentage-wise score quite high, but that still means if it's not 100%, a few people in your organization are having a bad experience. And then as you expand and grow, that number is just going to multiply. And so how do you make sure that you're addressing that early on, having those conversations and then making that into the culture so that it's there as you grow? Pavneet, I want to come over to you because, you know, we did hear a lot of depressing statistics in the previous in Marin's talk, and I know you've done research on this and talked to the folks who are leaving and why they're leaving. So it would be great to hear what do we do about it? So how do we make sure that we are creating cultures that, which is kind of a big question, isn't it? But yeah.
The data is so enlightening, isn't it? And we don't always explore why. We look at the outcomes, but not understand the reasoning. I did some research a few years back exploring women's transition into entrepreneurship, to understand the motivations behind why they were leaving their jobs to start their own business. And I was expecting to see all these people telling me these big goals, saying, I've always wanted to run my own business. I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur. I've always wanted to do this. But not one person said that to me. All I heard was, I had no other choice. I had to step away. I had to leave. And so what we explored was that they were leaving, the stats really relate to what Marin was sharing, but the rationale was quite common amongst these women. Their lack of flexibility, especially concerning motherhood, meant that they couldn't really progress in their careers as much as they wanted to. They were experiencing discrimination. Marin mentioned some stats around racially minoritized groups being more highly likely to leave. That was really common within the data too. And high pressured environments leading to burnout. Organizations didn't have the capability to support women through various different experiences. And so understanding why and seeing those trends was really not surprising, but still illuminating in helping businesses to understand what they need to do about it. And so all businesses are unique, obviously, and the triggers for why people might leave may be different. But firstly, understanding those trends, what's flexibility look like? What is there any harmful behavior that may be causing people to exit? What are the things that people need within the organization to be able to thrive? So in answer to your question of what we can do about it, we need to take the proactive steps to understand what those potential trigger points are and start to unpick where those barriers might lie, understand what people need to be healthy, be happy, to enable to work well, and design for that. And it's really linked into Sally's point, treat everything as a research project in order to understand the rationale and the reasoning in order to design the solution. So I would definitely, in terms of what to do next, definitely advise what Sally has just done within the organization and looking at what are the reasons why people are leaving, or what are the barriers to that they may perceive to them staying long term. I was having a conversation yesterday with a VC who were asking the question amongst themselves, are we set up well for parents? Because the data was telling them that the number of days that people are taking for parenthood leave was 3 days on average, because they didn't feel that they could possibly take longer than that. And it seems outrageous,
Wow.
but it was a cultural norm. And understanding why that was the case and what would happen if they were to explore that in a bit of a explore what flexibility could look like within that. What were the barriers that were stopping people from thinking they could take longer? I mean, I could talk about that all day, but something like that isn't just a redesign of a policy. There needs to be a bigger mindset shift amongst the organization around why we want to create a fair and supportive policy or practice, and understand what impact that could have on the ability for the individuals to thrive within the organization. So most crucially, one thing I would say would be work with the team to design the solutions. So yeah, a bit of a multifaceted response to your question there, Melissa.
Yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't going to have a simple answer, was it? But yeah, no, I mean, I think that the point around, like, you could have the most brilliant policies in the world, but if people still feel the pressure or the guilt or whatever it is to come back right away, it doesn't matter that you have a very generous policy. So policies only go so far when faced with culture and expectations. James, I want to come to you because it's particularly around the specific challenges in smaller organizations. So, a lot of things that there are challenges in startups with being able to offer tons of great benefits or progression. There might not be a lot of ways to get promoted because there just aren't that many roles. So how do you sort of give people those rewards or tap into things that can help keep them in the organization?
Yeah, I think it's funny because when you think about it, I think it goes beyond just the monetary side of things, I think, for me at least, because I think most people can never be paid enough, or at least what they think they're worth, and we could argue about, people who are on extremely high salaries in certain big tech companies in Silicon Valley, etc. But the premise of what I'm trying to say is that, for the most part, people in these sort of engineering roles in science and startups, a lot of the idea generation and residual work that you do is outside of your day-to-day work. So unlike someone who's doing, like, let's say shift work, where it's like you agree, okay, 20 pounds an hour, I come in and this is what I'm working. A lot of people in these sort of environments, there's a lot of value that actually happens outside of that. So I think because that's what people kind of join the companies for, because it's exciting, they get to use their mind, it's intellectually stimulating, it's not just about the pay. And we also know a lot of interesting things about the pay, in the sense that up to a certain level, when you earn X amount, depending on your jurisdiction, the increase is a bit diminishing. We also know that the happiest that the person is when they hear about a pay rise is the day it's confirmed, not even the day it goes into their bank account, because at that point it's old news. So we can't, use money as the only kind of motivator for people, because it's not the only thing. So we need to do more. And I think it's moving away from thinking of like, oh, how can we pay people more and like pay rises, and thinking more of the idea of life rises. So what can we do to increase the life quality of the teams that we have? So that looks at things like fulfillment, motivation, as Miriam talked about, psychological safety, autonomy. But I think for me, more importantly, especially as organizations grow, it's about recognition as well. It's understanding what and how to motivate and empower people. It's having the conversations with the teams, but also with the individuals, because we can't apply a blanket mode of recognition for every single person. So whilst praise is really important and public praise is great, some people hate it. And therefore, you need to understand, how do you balance that, right? Because some people do want the public praise, some people don't. And I think when you're more meaningful and targeted with your approach to things, it becomes a lot more powerful. So, avoid just taking everyone for lunch or giving, a £50 voucher to Amazon, because those are very impersonal things. And what will happen? People will sit at the cooler and be like, oh my God, is that what they think we're worth? Just like £50, I could have done that myself, right? And hopefully, we're paying people enough for them to be able to do those things. So I think for me, it comes down to things like work-life balance. We work in a company where we've got a lot of weekend work, cell work, etc. So we give people that time back. It avoids the burnout. It makes a person feel like, okay, I've gotten that time back, and I can actually live my life whilst I'm in this role. I don't have to feel like I'm sacrificing every element of me. I think personal development plans are an important thing. If you can have a budget, even better, but you don't necessarily need one. And I think what personal development plans do is they say, I want you to grow. They show that you're thinking about that person and that individual and their growth. And I think linked to growth, especially in startups, title changes, they cost you absolutely nothing as an organization, but they can be so transformative for the person because they feel like they're stepping into that role and they feel more empowered and more motivated to elevate themselves. So you saying you've become a senior someone, that person really, you see that difference because that person feels very empowered to work in that way. And I think it's these sort of gestures, or even thinking about taking people to events, taking people to conferences to help build their profile, in scientific settings, whether you put people on a poster or put them on an abstract or a paper that has been written. Again, it's showing that you recognize the impact and the contribution that person has. And another thing is also really about being intentional and understanding the skills of the people that you have within the organization. So if someone is great at like web design or graphics or photography and stuff, get them to help on the marketing and on the web design and stuff like that. We're a startup, right? So there's many things that need to be done. And when you do that, they feel recognized for their talents and they feel more valued. And typically as humans, when we feel valued, and we feel like we can bring more to the table, we're more motivated to contribute. So I think for me, it's about being observant and intentional, and also importantly, from a leadership perspective, removing yourself and your ego from it, because some of these things might be very like, oh, why would that even matter? Well, that's true for you as a founder, as a CEO, leader, but it makes a massive difference to other people. So I think what life raises can we bring to our people that, help to kind of like make people stay and feel empowered more than just about the paycheck.
I love that, life phrases. That's definitely something that we're gonna publicize a bit more. That's a great idea. Yeah, a couple of years ago, I did my honeycomb feedback, and one of the behaviors I scored lower on was asking people about their values and understanding that. So I actually went and had a conversation with folks about what are the things they valued, and it opened up such really interesting conversations that meant like, oh, I can help you with that. Like that's something that I can facilitate, and that's something that we can work with you on. So yeah, I think that point of just remembering that everybody isn't motivated by the same things is a really important one. So Brian, over to you, and James did start talking about leaders and egos, so good segue into talking about how do you as a leader make sure that you're showing vulnerability, being authentic, but also not centering yourself, making it all about you, and sort of looking after other folks. Like, how do you balance all of these different things when you're sort of showing up for your team?
I think a leader's first relationship is with themselves, and the second relationship is with their power. And when you have really excellent leadership, those things are more or less aligned. And when you have really bad leadership or poor leadership, those things are misaligned. Obviously, if you have toxic leadership, it's way off the charts. If you're dealing with a narcissist or something, this doesn't apply. But I think the real difference between leaders who are comfortable and prepared and can move through these challenges is that they focus on their own relationship, which is their own character, and they also really focus on the power that they wield and their responsibility and their accountability and their obligations to the teams. And the more those two things are aligned, and it doesn't mean it's 10 out of 10 all the time, and it doesn't mean it's all the way together all the time, but the more those two things are the focus of a leader's personal journey, the better the possible outcomes will be. And most leaders who we think of as bad leaders or poor leaders are, I feel, uncomfortable or incapable of dealing with that balance. They don't want to look internally. They don't want to that own self-development, and they're not able to deal with the power that they wield, because they've got to do both simultaneously. And this is a pretty difficult thing. I mean, being human and figuring out who you are is challenging enough without having all of this other responsibility for these other lives. So the best leadership quote I know is from Warren Bennis, who said, "Becoming a leader is synonymous with becoming yourself. First and foremost, it's precisely that easy and that difficult. First and foremost, find out what it is you are about and be that. What it is you are about and be that." And so that's this process of becoming. And that means leaders really want to have the proper focus. What do they have to do? They've got to investigate it. They've got to become a student of leadership. They have to get some help, and they've got to practice, and they've got to practice some of these things away from others, because the last thing you want to do as someone with leadership or management responsibility is to take your own sense of, I really don't know what's going on, and dump that on the people who are looking to you for some sense of direction. So that's what authenticity actually is to be your own author. And if you go away and do some work off stage and you figure out how it is you want to behave and how it is you want to show up to lead, you bring that on stage, and there's a greater possibility of that alignment between yourself and your power.
Yeah. So it's not just about sharing absolutely everything that you're thinking at all times. It does require a bit of thinking and preparation so that you're expressing that in a way that is actually going to be useful and helpful to your team while still being true and honest.
Yes.
Yeah. So shifting from leaders to managers a bit, James, wanted to come back to you to talk about that management experience, because another thing that we see often in startups and scale-ups is folks who were not managers, were peers, and maybe in a sort of more casual kind of environment, then all of a sudden being put into this management position and being faced with either, how do I sort of navigate that shift in my relationship with the folks who used to be my peers and potentially also my good friends?
Yes. Yeah. No, yeah, I think that the startup world especially is very dynamic, and things can literally change overnight, sometimes over an hour. And, you know, it might be the fact that you've gotten more funding, you may have more joiners, or there's an organizational change that means that, you know, you have to have yourself or other people step into a new role. And that's often because of the dynamic, fast-paced nature that was introduced at the beginning by Marin, something that happens typically without a lot of training or preparation. And, you know, the idea is, you know, we're a startup, we just get things done. And that is a bit of an issue at this point when we're talking about people, because now we're dealing with and impacting on people. So the very nature of the relationships that we have end up having to go through some sort of like change. And I really echo what Brian was saying. I think firstly, it's about self-awareness. It's understanding who you are and how you want to be as a manager or as a leader, understanding the sort of boundaries that you now need to put in place because you're now privy to different information and all these sort of things. And you need to think about how you're going to conduct yourself and what is your authentic self in this new role that you find yourself in. I worked with one of my coachees, and they moved into a management role, and they're like, you know, how much do I tell people? Like, do I feel disingenuous by like not saying everything? Like, how much do I disclose? And one of the things, you know, we discussed about was what is right for you as a person whilst balancing your responsibilities around careful messaging and appropriate transparency. So it's that balance, is that authenticity. And for me personally, when anyone joins my team, I actually send them a little manifesto that I've written that's called James as a Leader. So they understand who I am as a person. It means that hopefully we're aligned. It's transparency and also accountability so that they understand, you know, they can hold me accountable for what I say I'm going to do. So I think those are really important things. And I think the other thing is bringing others on board to the journey and being like, look, I'm going through this journey, like bear with me whilst I'm going through this. I may make some mistakes. Please give me some feedback as to kind of how I'm doing and really adjusting. Am I being too distant? You know, have I changed too much? And, you know, we've talked about it a lot, but I think feedback is so important, both the feedback you can have in person, but also, you know, the Honeycomb works. There's the Culture Plus platform. One of the cells that you know we use is the inclusive leadership cell. So that's a really good way of kind of having that barometer to understand, you know, how am I actually doing within this metric, and really understanding, you know, what are people thinking, more than what they may say to you verbally, right? Because we know sometimes that there can be a bit of a difference. And I'll just put in a little personal anecdote, which is when I joined the company, and we started to grow, the first person that I hired, for the first almost year, we were side by side in the lab. We would talk about everything and anything. And then when other people came in, there had to be that rebalancing, because I needed to be careful to make sure that other people don't feel left out, or that there's this automatic favoritism for that person, but also that they didn't feel like they'd been neglected or othered. So it's not easy, and it's constantly adjusting. And I think that's the thing about talent and leadership and all of it. It's not easy, but it is really important work. And I think there is a duty of care as well as an organization to make sure that we're supporting, mentoring, coaching people through these transitions. And also importantly, being patient. It's hard. It's the first time people are doing these sort of things. And we really have to be empathetic and compassionate when we're dealing with people, and, we're helping to support them through all of this. So yeah, I think it's an exciting journey for the person, but yeah, there's a lot of support that's required for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great points in there, in terms of like, we see in a lot of the startups and scale ups, that initial sort of group is really tight and core, and then they have more people coming in, and it's sort of hard for them to feel like they're part of the team, and there forms this sort of us and them. So it's a really interesting sort of dynamic when you're growing at that rate. And actually, it's a really good segue to talk about taking action. Do have a bunch more questions for Sally, Brian, and Pavneet. So we're going to come back to those after we check in with Marin with some tips on how to take action. And also we will come back to your questions as well. So do feel free to put them in the Q&A function using the platform. But for now, I'm going to turn over to Marin to share some tips on what you can do to take action, and then we'll be back with a panel. Marin.
Great, thank you, Melissa, and thank you to the brilliant panel. I think everything I'm about to share is just going to build on those thoughts and experiences that have been shared. So hopefully it'll be a nice way to pull it all together and give you some tangible actions to take and go away with. As always, we'll share the deck so you have it afterwards. So I think it was Pavneet that mentioned you need to look at the triggers. You need to find out exactly what's happening and really dig into the data and the evidence, a big theme underlying. And I think that in terms of deciding after today's webinar what you should do, I would absolutely advise that as a first step. What's the situation for you particularly? But looking at the data and the research more generally, there's a really fantastic piece of research from Gallup quite recently that looked at kind of the way we can theme the reasons people leave, the reasons people give for leaving their roles. And James is absolutely spot on. I would assume it was wages, having not looked too closely at it, and that actually doesn't it features, but it's not in that top kind of quadrant of why people leave. Everything that is in the top reasons can be grouped under engagement and culture, which is great. Okay, we've got some reasons, but I think the challenging piece of that is, what does that actually mean in terms of what you should do? What does people leave because of engagement and culture actually mean? So here I've said engagement equals managers. And by that, I mean, what you should do is focus on your manager behavior, because again, a further piece of research looked at how do we shift engagement? How do we shift how people feel and their experience at work? And 70% of the variance in team engagement can be accounted for by managers, by manager behavior. So when we talk about shifting engagement, the best place you can focus is on your managers. And what about culture? So this one is a little bit, it can be even more woolly and fluffy. And how do we get to grips with that? Well, that's actually what we do. We really believe that that's about how people are behaving. So your culture is ultimately the way people show up every day, what they do, what they don't do, the language they use, the decisions they make, the way they interact with their colleagues. So you focus on your engagement by focusing on managers, you focus on your culture by digging into how are people behaving and how do I expect them to behave. So then impact, how do you measure it? So you've decided you're going to do these two things and really focus on building retention as a strength in your organization. How are you going to figure out what is and isn't working? And how are you going to figure out what the problem is at the moment? I think there was a really lovely theme throughout everything actually in that panel around feedback, and particularly leadership feedback. you know, that vulnerability, the alignment of who am I and who am I as a leader? How do I bring myself and my power closer together? And I think self-awareness came up as a term. We're really bad at self-awareness. And I'm not saying us on the panel, I'm saying as a general rule, most people don't have a particularly accurate understanding of their own performance, particularly connected to things that can be quite emotive, like how do I make other people feel? How do I come across as a communicator? Things that touch our sense of self are even more likely to show a gap between other people's perception and our perception. So you need to get feedback, particularly for managers, and it needs to be focused on exactly those questions. How do I make people feel? What's people's perception of the way I do appraisals? What's people's perceptions of the way I run my one-to-one? How do people experience my conduct in meetings? If you don't have the feedback, you don't know what to do. You've no idea, you're starting from a blank slate. And I know you probably all have evidence and data on the call, so gather the data around behavior. And then data early and often. So feelings and how people are behaving. I think Sally shared a really great example of how your approach should be really embedded in the data specific to your organization. So we have this data that shows this is the thing we need to work on. We're going to do it. I've said early and often, this is really about doing it before you think you have a problem. Because if you don't gather data regularly, then the first you'll know of the potential issues or the triggers, as Pavneet said, is when people leave, at which point it's too late. You're at that point of 30 grand trying to recruit somebody equally brilliant. So do it before you think you need to. So building on that point of gathering data, you have your data. That might feel, I'm not sure if it does or doesn't for you on the call, but it might feel, again, a little bit hard to tangibly think, okay, well, what will the data tell me and how can I put something in action? How does that translate into an intervention or a training program or even a conversation with my managers? How do I know what to do with the data? So I thought I'd pull a couple of examples from the Culture Plus platform, which we've shared a little bit about, but I think Melissa will share in a moment a little bit more info. But it has allowed us to gather behavioural data in the engineering startup space in the UK specifically. So this is aggregate data that is very pertinent to your context. And for example, this is one piece of information that really clearly shows you where to focus to improve retention. And it's a question around inclusive communication. And our data indicates really convincingly that women are hearing less of the kind of language or the less of the kind of behavior you would want to hear in an inclusive space. And by that, I said women don't hear their colleagues interjecting or interrupting as much as men do. So the reason I pulled that one out is because actually when we think about why people leave, why you suddenly, like, you're committed to your mission, you really believe in the product, would you stay somewhere where you heard disrespectful language, if it was misogynistic, for example, for the women on the call, if you repeatedly heard demeaning or infantilizing language, would you stay? Could you manage that every day? Particularly then, let's go a step further, if your managers weren't objecting, so if the person you respect, you do your one-to-ones, was kind of letting it slide or laughing or even participating in it, I think, well, I can tell you, I would leave. There's no way I'd be sticking around because it would just make me so angry. It would have an impact on my well-being. So I would be in a position where I would have to leave at a certain point. So these are the reasons people leave, these repeated behaviors, these small instances that build up and make workplaces really non-inclusive and kind of unmanageable for certain people. And then just another example on this slide. Now, I don't expect you to read all that information, please don't worry, but essentially I'm just flagging for you here feedback. It's a really clear theme in terms of what we need to focus on for retention. It is also, ironically, the behavior that has the lowest scores for this aggregate group of engineering startup and scale-ups. And by that, I mean, it's consistently the behavior that people are not doing as often as they should, asking for feedback. It's also consistently the behavior that people are drawn to. So people have autonomy to choose their own areas of development and support. And people seem to know that this isn't something they're good at. And the data really does back that up. You can see at the very bottom of the list there of a long list of behaviors is asks for feedback. And Adnan can definitely share more at some point as the person who digs into all of that. So very, very briefly, just to really hammer that point home, I suppose, if you do not have a culture of honest feedback, particularly with leaders and managers, you will not be in a position to catch problems in time. So it's something to spend time with. It's probably not it's not the thing that will solve a retention issue, but it's a really great place to start focusing on if you've nothing else that you think you can implement straight away. Okay, so with that final thought, I'm going to pass back over to Melissa to close off and then jump back into some of those interesting questions. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, Marin. So we're going to go back to the panel in a moment. But first, I just wanted to briefly mention Culture Plus, the Honeycomb platform, because you've heard it referred to a couple of times. And this is the platform that we developed in partnership with the Royal Academy of Engineering to support startups and scale-ups, specifically in the engineering space. You might have guessed the Royal Academy of Engineering really cares about folks in the engineering space. And the point of it is to help create those inclusive and innovative cultures from early on in an organization's journey. And we built it because the existing systems out there were too big and bulky to weave into your intense, time-poor environments and didn't really focus on the things that were critical to you at the stage that you are at. So with Culture Plus, everyone gets a personal habit development tool to build positive behaviors and share useful, structured feedback with each other. And the organization gets a map of their strengths and their biggest areas of risk. You also get the belonging survey that Sally referred to understand how people are feeling. So it gives you that data picture that can get you in front of those emerging risks and address issues before they become big problems and have a negative impact on your business. We've got an amazing group of organizations already signed up, and we'd love for you to join us and be one of them. So if you'd like to learn more, please get in touch, or we've got a group demo coming up. You can sign up for that. We're also offering a consultation for the folks on this call. So that's a 60-minute session to talk to you about what your challenges are, give you a little bit of a culture checkup and advice. And I think Brian said it before, you can't do this alone. We're here to help. So do get in touch, take advantage of this. We'll put links in the chat, and with that, we're going to go back to the panel questions. So yeah, so back to our panelists, and I'm going to put their faces and names up there again, just in case you wanted to direct any questions specific to them. But I did, before we get to the audience questions, I did have a couple more that I wanted to ask. And the first one is for Pavneet to talk about onboarding and the importance of that experience. How do you set that foundation? So you've done all your great work on inclusive recruitment. You've got a wonderful group of people or person to come into the organization. How do you make that first?
I love that you've asked me that question, because I love talking about onboarding, because it really is one of the quickest wins for employee retention. And it often goes unnoticed or uncared for because we think that retention needs to happen within the core of the people experience. But there's a really interesting research study by, I think it was Bob, and I think the statistic was something like 64% of new employees are likely to leave a new job within the first year if they have really poor onboarding. And that's huge. It's massive. We think back to the costs that Miriam was talking about earlier. And so I guess what makes a good onboarding process with this lens of inclusion is very, very similar. I might summarize some of the things that yourself, that Melissa and James have shared through this conversation, because onboarding isn't just about getting new starters up to speed. It's about setting them up for success, and ensuring that it is a two-way street, that we're able to establish expectations, but also explore theirs as well. It's a really opportunistic time to understand their work style and for them to understand ours and to sync well. And James and Melissa both mentioned separately earlier in the conversation how important it is to ask people what motivates them, what they value, what their long-term career goals are, and figure out how you can help them achieve that. How do they prefer to communicate? What's their, going back to feedback, as Miriam was mentioning, what's their preferred way of giving and receiving feedback? Start the expectation up front that feedback is an important part of retention and engagement. So let's start talking about it at the beginning, understanding their strengths, and make sure you're doing the things that are going to be able to support those strengths. So I guess what I'm saying here is nothing new from what we've been talking about all through this conversation, but doing it right up front in the first 6 weeks of that person starting is going to have tremendous positive impact on their long-term experience, because you're creating the foundations of success together, really.
Yeah, and it's that really crucial period to make them feel like they belong, right? In that place. And I think as James said with the salary increase, right? You get excited when you get the job offer, and then by the time you get there, are you still excited? Are you still enthusiastic? Or are you all of a sudden like, I'm really confused and I don't know what's going on and I'm experiencing high stress. So so yeah, so really important critical point. And as you said, sets the foundation. Brian, back to you, because I think on the inclusive recruitment side of things, we talked about how you think about sort of designing roles as you're going from 5 to 10, 10 to 20. But can you talk a little bit about how you then on the culture side of things, make sure that the organization is set up for that? And a lot of the founders we talk to, the point they come to us is where we're growing and we want to keep our culture. How do we keep it? How do we not lose it? So so what would your advice be for that?
Just expanding on what Pravneet said, which is about the having someone new come on board is often when a company first thinks about being culturally aligned in some ways, because I think we've all been in a situation where we've been recruited with one story and we get to the company and it's another story, and it's like, here's the introduction, here's your onboarding, and the candidate says, and the now employee says, wait a minute, I thought it was done this way, and people say, no, it's really done that way. So I mean, I think it's absolutely critical to look at this, to look at the recruiting challenge as much more of a change challenge. And what Sally talked about, going from 20 people to 40 people in a year, that's pretty typical. Let's grow 100%. And most hiring managers will treat this in a sequential way. They'll say, we have a team of 5, I need to hire 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And the hiring manager will try to do most of the work and maybe involve the existing team a bit, but not as fully as they could. And my advice is to really engage the team, the existing team of 5, in the work of understanding and planning for what the team of 10 will actually be like, and talking about all of these things that we've talked about around cultural realities and motivations and roles and responsibilities and identity and affiliation and this sense of belonging. And how are things going to change for these 5 people when they're actually 10? I think James was talking about when he was working side by side with people and it was just the 2 of them, and then you got person number 3 and person number 4 and person number 5, and it's always a re-reconciliation. So if you want cultural consistency, and there's that energy from the top saying, yes, we are going to be culturally consistent, involving as many people as possible in that for every time that there is a change event is the best way to be open about it. And I think you want to talk about making inclusive recruiting stick, and diverse recruiting stick, that's the way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think taking that view of your culture as a whole and not just individuals sort of coming in, but growing those teams, really absolutely crucial. Sally, I want to come back to you, and to think about how do we, a lot of times organizations, founders, leaders, HR folks, talent folks will think about inclusion as this sort of separate, siloed thing that they have to do, that they have to work on. How do we shift that into thinking about it woven through everything, so not as an extra thing on top of all of our other work that we have to do?
Yeah, definitely. And I think through kind of recruitment processes and onboarding processes, I think it is still important to ask, do people need reasonable adjustments? Like, what can we do to make an environment more inclusive for you? But I think with that, it's designing our recruitment processes and designing our onboarding processes and our performance management processes with inclusivity in mind. And I think Pavni and Brian have both said, you have to bring people in. So when we're designing our recruitment processes, it's getting input from lots of different people to make sure that we're thinking about lots of different things. So we've made some really small changes around sharing a recruitment process online to give people that comfortable feelings. They know what they're going to kind of walk into going through that recruitment process. And we started with sharing the technical interviews in advance as well, because we're not interviewing people to understand how good they are at interviewing. We really want to know, like, what's their approach to problems and things like that. So that's been really beneficial, and looking at now bringing that through to our behavioural interviews. So really kind of designing our processes with inclusivity in mind, I think, is really important. And it's like with onboarding, again, we can ask someone, what can we do to be, more accommodating and a more inclusive kind of onboarding process for you. But actually, if we're suggesting, are there any tools that you need? We've currently got Grammarly. Is that something that would be useful for you? And just kind of giving them some ideas of things that we do as standard, but we're still obviously looking to learn, I think is really key. And I think that to create an inclusive culture, I think you just have to be talking about it all the way through the recruitment process. We have the behaviours that we work with the managers and with the team on building for each of our roles and advertise them in every one of our positions. We talk about it through the process, and in our onboarding process, we share a D&I pack now. We share our belonging survey results. We talk about, what some of the problems were and what we're doing. We're really open and transparent, and just really trying to embed that inclusivity into everything that we're doing, and hoping that has good results. And then we're now about to embed Honeycomb Works, which I'm super excited about, because we really care about inclusivity and we really care that people feel like they belong. But we also care about people learning and developing. So having a tool that can assess where we are and what our strengths are, and where there's some development areas, and actually giving them a platform to be able to do that is amazing. So we're really excited to roll it out. We're actually doing a presentation to the leadership team tomorrow. So really, really happy to be working on that, and really showing that commitment, not just to inclusivity, but to growth and development as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And you brought up the platform, so I'm just going to add one thing about it, which is, the interesting thing is when we looked at the behaviors around inclusion, so many of them are not just inclusion behaviors, right? They're just good behaviors that, when you practice them equally, turn into inclusion behaviors. And when you think about like inclusive design, if you design for folks who might struggle with your process or product or whatever it is, you end up making a better experience for everyone. I think it was the Royal Academy of Engineering event where I saw a teacher, and the guidance was, if a student says they might have ADHD or they might be neurodiverse in some way, just do the accommodations, because it actually improves outcomes regardless of whether or not it's an accurate diagnosis. And I'm sitting there like, why are you waiting for somebody to say, I think I might have it? Then why don't we just design everything that way if it improves outcomes for everyone? And I think you alluded to earlier the ways that you're changing your meeting practices and things like that. So yeah, I think that when you think about these things and weaving them through, it doesn't just become about diversity. It just becomes about ways of creating great cultures where great things happen. And when you look at the research around what creates an innovative culture, what creates an inclusive culture, the Venn diagram is a circle. So that's the good news, is that you can develop these things and just improve everything as you're improving inclusion and belonging. So yeah, something that I do care a bit about. So I'm going to stop talking about that now. And actually, we're going to go to the audience Q&A. I see a couple of things have come into host and panelists, because that is the default. So when you talk about design, sort of nudging people in a specific direction. So if folks do want to pop stuff into the Q&A, please feel free. But the first question that we have is, people love to hear about people's mistakes. Where do people get it wrong? And I think, and in particular for first-time founders, potentially we have some first-time founders on the call, but what are some of the common mistakes they make? And if anybody wants to jump in on that one first, I think it's open to the entire panel.
I'm happy to
Okay.
say, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Sally.
I was just going to say hiring too fast, waiting too late before realizing that you need a role, not kind of planning ahead, and hiring too fast. And then that has that knock-on effect to the overall culture, particularly when you're small, it can have such a big impact bringing the wrong person in. So if you leave it too late and you have to make a quick decision, I would say that's definitely one thing.
So being more proactive about looking ahead to see where you're going to need help and support so that you don't need to hire somebody immediately and you can take the time to find the right person. Yeah. Brian, you had something you wanted to share?
In the context of retention, I think either first-time founders or first-time leaders and managers, or those who just don't have much experience, fail to recognize the things that James was talking about in terms of what's actual recognition and what are real motivators and what are the things beyond the tangible rewards that matter to people. And most people want to be involved in organizations that are trying to solve complicated problems, trying to do big things. They want to be in an environment where they're learning. They want to be in an environment that's actually pushing them forward. They want their peers to be that. They want this energy. And it's funny, Melissa, you mentioned that you've got a client who said something about, we're afraid everyone's going to leave, I think. And I've got a client like that as well. And so there's an issue with the leader who just wants to put everyone in bubble wrap because they're afraid that if there's any upset, or there's any friction, or there's anything, and this leader feels, well, I can control the situation by just keeping everyone not safe and not coddled. It's not that pejorative, but just wanting to put them in bubble wrap. I mean, that was the term that was first introduced to me. And the two people in the group who have said, I really think I'm going to leave, have said, I'm just not being challenged. I'm not involved in this stuff, and I don't understand what the manager is doing. And so I think it's very easy, from my lens, it all goes back to issues of power. This fellow is not comfortable with his power. He's not comfortable in figuring out how to set direction and how to work through these interpersonal dynamics. And yes, they're messy. And of course, you need that creative friction, obviously in a safe space, if you want to do this well, if you want to do this better. But as you've just said, Melissa, these aren't really special behaviors in terms of, these aren't extraordinary behaviors. These are just behaviors that should be table stakes. If you want to have an environment people want to be in, this is what you do. And obviously it leads to all manner of belonging. So these are the things that should just be foundational, but it's pretty hard to know how to do this. My other theme is that everyone needs help. It's hard to know how to do this if you haven't done it before, you haven't had some role models.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the specific quote, we heard it from a few people, but the specific quote was actually from somebody who was like, okay, so we've got guaranteed investment, but we have to hit milestones and we'll be fine as long as not a single person leaves the organization. So then it's, how do you then balance that, not wrapping people in bubble wrap, because obviously they're there to be challenged, and the milestones were achievable, but challenging. So and I think it was just that ongoing just anxiety of, we don't have any backup, right? We don't have any redundancy built into the system. We don't have anybody who can step in for anybody else.
That sounds like such a venture capital thing to do, is just to say, you have to keep the headcount at this number. And it's like, really? Does it matter? Anyway.
Yeah. Miranda, I'm curious if you had a perspective on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. So the question being, why do people get it wrong? And I think the thing that really comes through in the research and the conversations we've had with folks is that it's not intention. Like, people really do intend to create cultures where people want to stay, and for many reasons. We share the myriad of reasons why that's the case. I think one of the real pitfalls is making decisions that are not data driven. So anything that comes from, well, I think this is the case, or my experience is XYZ, or as a founder, I have a really good understanding of how people are feeling. Probably, maybe, potentially, who knows? I think unless you are digging into that data and doing those engagement surveys and gathering that nuanced information around what's going on for different groups. There's loads of kind of problems that come into that decision making, like confirmation bias. You look for information that confirms what you believe to be true, particularly when you're very invested in an organization, in a startup, when it's your baby and you've been growing it. It's very difficult to have an objective perspective, which is why you need data. And it's also, I think James mentioned it, very difficult as a leader to have an understanding of people's experience, because there's a really interesting piece of research around the closer you are to power, that theme again. If you are at the center of power, your capacity to be empathetic and really understand the experiences of the folks like a couple of levels out really diminishes, and there's not a lot you can do about it except check in with your perceptions. So yeah, not being data driven and not holding this part of your organizational movements to the same high standards you would product development or revenue analysis or any of those other evidence-based kind of activities.
Yeah, I think there's also an element there of people don't necessarily know. So like you might, like even in our own context, right? We did our own belonging survey and scored very high. Thank you very much. But some things were, you know, strongly agree and others were agree. And when we sat down as a team, I don't know that any of us would have said, hey, yeah, there's a problem here. But actually, when we sat down and said, hey, why are there different scores here? We had a really good, honest conversation about things that we needed to change and do differently. And even like I think about across all the startups and scale ups, we found consistently women scoring people lower on being open to, on people being open when they hear feedback that contradicts their point of view. So women weren't being listened to as much when they were challenging something. And the difference was something like 10%. And on an individual basis as a woman, I might not notice that, or I might not know that that isn't because, well, that idea wasn't that great or whatever reason, or well, Brian just doesn't get it. So that's, but we know that in the aggregate, right, that will have a difference on whether or not people are feeling like they're being heard, their ideas are being followed up on. And then, I just might feel like, you know what, I'm not thriving here. But if a leader asks me, is there anything wrong? I'm gonna be like, no, everything's fine. I might not know why, but I might not know that I don't feel like I'm thriving here. So I think that's the other really important thing about the data. And, my background is product. You can't ask a direct question, right? Because people don't know the answer. So you have to really sort of dig in and understand and empathize and understand the nuance of what they're saying. And I think about the same thing in this work. So
could I add something else onto that, Melissa?
Yeah.
I know that obviously we're talking about retention through this whole thing as sort of something that is the end goal, but is it the end goal? Maybe controversially, do we want retention for the sake of retention, or do we want retention for specific reasons? And what Maureen said about accessing the data to understand what it is that we want as a result of retention is what we should be looking at. But if we've got sort of a very squiggly bell curve when it comes to performance, or when we have, as you say, like motivation pockets which are low within the organization, and actually based on our trajectory of growth, that's not something that we want to prioritize changing, then question if retention is the number one goal, or is there something beneath that?
Yeah, and sometimes we can't support people in the growth that they want to grow in the direction they want to go in. And we had a brilliant delivery manager, and she wanted to develop her art career. I couldn't really help her. I mean, we did some interesting things, but there's a certain point at which she's gonna leave and go and get an artistic job. And I think there's a point of like, yeah, we want people to leave happy, and it's not necessarily healthy that people just hang on for dear life. And I think that piece too is also an important one. But that sort of also gets back to that, I can't let anybody leave because I don't have them. But being proactive about planning, like, okay, so if somebody was going to leave, like, how would we actually fill that or cover that? I just wanted to check, Brian, I see you have something to say, but I just wanted to check in with James to see if there's anything you wanted to add to this piece.
No, I mean, I echo everything that everyone said, and I think it's really that self-awareness piece is super important. And I think it comes down to really accepting that typically, if you are a founder or a leader in engineering or a tech company, your skills are probably more in the product development, the tech side, etc. So get the help, get the consultants, get the appropriate support to help you with this, because for some people it's natural, for some people it's not. So you might just not understand people's perspective, not because you're trying to just push it aside, but just because it doesn't resonate, and you need that support to help you understand why it's important and the value that it brings. And just being, I say this a lot, but yeah, removing that sense of ego. We don't know everything, and being accepting of assistance and support.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one of the things I always say to people too is we need help, and we live and breathe this stuff, but we still need to do our our surveys. We still need to get our feedback, and every so often have somebody from the outside come and help us, because it's really hard to look at your own culture objectively, and especially as a founder. I think so much of you're so emotionally connected to it. She says, not from any personal experience whatsoever, but that it can be hard to sort of separate it from, like, what do you mean the thing that I lead isn't a happy, productive, innovative place? And that is not about me. It's not about me. It's not, well, to some degree it is, but there are things, it's not about who I am. It's might be about my behaviors, but yeah, I mean, I think you always need that sort of, whether it's via technology, surveys, data, brilliant HR consultants like the ones that we have on the call today, but like getting that sort of outside view, I think is a really important one. And Brian, I do think you had something that you wanted to.
Just very quickly, I think that the greatest challenge with an organization that's growing quickly in terms of hiring is that the hiring activities themselves crowd out everything else. They drown out all of the oxygen in the organization when you're trying to hire 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people a month or even a week. And I've done this several times with several startups in Silicon Valley and in London, and there's just no other energy for any of this change trajectory, any of this self-reflection, any of this wondering what we're doing, talking about how do we properly onboard and train people and find out their motivations and build relationships. And so it's so important for small companies to have some reflection of the bigger picture here. And it doesn't mean you have to hire a chief organizational effectiveness officer. It just means you've got to get some perspective in to hold these mirrors up, so that you don't, as Sally said, you're hiring too fast. I mean, I was with a company and all of a sudden we were 350 people, and the CEO walked into my office one day and said, there are probably 150 people who shouldn't be here. And it wasn't out of any malice. It wasn't it was just, investors told us to grow, and this is what we did, but we had no way of supporting it. And so you've got to at least have a reflection so you can have the conversations. As you've said, Melissa, sometimes it's not the direct answer to the direct question. It's discovering the answers around the question. And to do that, you have to have these different points of view. That's it.
Yeah, well, I mean, that brings us to, I think, another question that has come in, and is probably going to be our last question, and is related to that, which is, how do you find the time? So when you're a founder and you've got investors making demand, or you're seeking funding, and as everybody tells me, that is a full-time job in itself, takes you completely out of the business, or you're trying to cure cancer and democratize cellular technology for everyone, and clean up our water, save the world. Like, how do you actually find time to look at your culture? Sorry, I've very simplified the work that you've been doing, but like, how do you actually find the time? And I think as you're talking, if you wanted to share any final points and reflections on that, because we'll be wrapping up then after that question. Anybody want to add that? Yeah. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, I'll say from my perspective, how you find the time, I think it's leveraging the people you have around you, and not making it something that you're trying to solve by yourself. And that can look like a myriad of different ways, but it's really, figuring out, how can I make this a shared vision of retention, of inclusivity, etc., within the organization. That way, it doesn't become a burden for just one person. And you know, we've said it many times, but it's also bringing in the tools, bringing in the support, the consultancy, etc. That also helps to make sure that you still have the capacity to do all the other things you need to do, but actually this still has the attention and care that it truly deserves, because I do believe it's so important to everything that we do, and in fact, it's at the core of everything that we do, in my opinion. So I think that's how it's really leveraging the support and the resources that you have, and I think that the intentionality of wanting to do it for the right reasons is also really important, because otherwise it stops it from becoming a box ticking exercise, because we all know what happens with those. You tick the box the first time around and then you forget it about, and you try to dust it off at a later point. So I think when you've got that intentionality, that helps. And I think my closing points would be, when it comes to retention and people and inclusivity, I think it's really about especially for retention, you know, respect people, trust people, and nurture people. And I think if you do those things, it really does help.
That's fantastic. Respect, trust, and nurture. That's a great, great summary. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? How do you find the time, or share your final thought on the topic?
I think my final thought is what James shared over life rises. Don't forget that. Life rises over pay rises. If you take anything away from today, make it that comment.
Yeah,
Great tagline.
absolutely. Yeah, love that.
And also your manifesto. Sorry, James, just taking all of your points. I love that I've got these actions to go away with myself. That's why these events are so good. But I love that. I know there's something out there, it's like the manual of me, and I think that's a really good idea. So definitely something I'm going to go and look into a little bit further.
Yeah, we might have to do an infographic of James's top tips, I think, as a follow-up. But yeah, that's great.
One thought just to add, the from Sally, gathering also from the panel, I think that idea of building this into your structures and processes, so it's not something you're having to redo every time, it's the way things are done, and it's the habit formation of, particularly the opportunity when you're a startup, you're building from scratch, you have that brilliant opportunity, so just prioritize it in everything you do, and then it's not something you find time for, it's just the way you do things as a standard approach. So that one's from Sally, I think, the structures and processes piece.
I think it's like, if you don't take the time to rest, you know, your body will decide when. And it's the same thing. If you don't take the time to do this, you'll have the repercussions of people leaving and having cultural issues and things like that. So it's definitely worth embedding in.
All right. Fantastic. Well, we are just about at time. So I'm going to say huge thanks to James, Pavneet, Brian, and Sally for your time, your insights. Also big thanks to Marin and Adnan for your insights and depressing stats, but then also really helpful tips on things to do, and Adnan for your wonderful moderation and support on the platform. And of course, to all of our attendees, thank you for spending some time with us, and also to prioritize thinking about culture in the face of all your other demanding priorities. Much appreciated. Don't forget to book in your free culture consultation. As you've heard, you can't do it alone, and we are here to help. This is free, no obligation, and it is a discussion about what's going on in your organization with recommendations that aren't all Adopt Culture Plus. Our next event is actually in September, so we will see you after the summer, which seems to have come back here in the UK, in London at least, which is fantastic. So we'll see you then. If you're subscribed, don't worry, we'll send you all the information on that. If you have not subscribed, well, I don't know what to tell you. So why don't you subscribe? But thank you again. We do hope that you will stay in touch. Again, 3 ways to do that. Book your culture checkup, sign up for the group demo, and sign up to our newsletter. And I think all the links have gone in the chat, and there's a reference for you. Very bad practice, too many calls to action, I know, but I can't make a decision about what would be best for you. You need to, but do very much hope that you will stay in touch, and we'll see you again. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thank
Thanks,
you all.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.